Hey kids, so today I'm going to go over the notes we took in class, the components of studying the past for Unit 1 in Human Geography. You should have a copy of this PowerPoint that you either are writing your notes on, this Google Slides that you're putting into your own notebook, or you could be writing them down and taking your own notes as you go. Measures of time. A decade is 10 years, and the root word DEC means 10, so that every 10 years we have a new decade. That's one way that we look at time. Another way is grouping it by years of 100. It's still based on that metric system where centi means 100, but a century, of course, is 100 years. Now, I didn't include millennium here, but a millennia is 1,000 years because typically when we're looking back at history, if you group something that large, you're looking at an era, which is just a larger chunk of time when you have common characteristics of a place. And some eras that we study are like prehistory or early civilizations, the classical world, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. These are times over history that we study. Then you have timelines. Timelines is another way that we put things into order so that we can study them and understand them. So timelines work like number lines in that the BCE is actually like negative numbers, in that the closer we get to the Common Era time, the BCE, the before Common Era, the number gets smaller or lower. So that the year 500 BCE happened before the year 150 BCE, right? 500 comes before 150. That doesn't make sense, except for the BCE, remember, is like negative years. So the numbers go from larger numbers down to smaller numbers. Then, when you get here in between these two, there's no year that's a 0 year, but we do change from day 1 BCE to day 1 CE. And at that time, when we move to Common Era, that's when we start increasing the years. And so 1 CE happened before 50 CE, which happened before 100 CE, or 150 CE, which happens before 500 CE. Right now, we're in the year 2020 CE, 2020 Common Era. So when you look at from now until 1 BCE, you've got 2020 years that happened between then. So that's how we go to count time. Remember that BCE used to be called BC, that was considered before Christ, and CE in some things that you'll see in print are referred to as AD, that's after Dominion. And as historians, they gathered together and decided that they needed to have more common terms to use to refer to history. Because as you look throughout the world, even throughout America, we don't all follow the same religions. We don't all center our studies around one particular God. So, in order to be more inclusive in history and to be more accurate, they changed the way someone had given the terms AD and BC so that you had BCE, before Common Era, and now CE, Common Era. Now on to sources. So, sources are ways that we learn about our history. We can get information from people, from places, from things like newspapers, news articles, filmings, recordings. These are things that we come across that we can get information from. There are two types of sources that we use. One is a primary source, and a primary source is going to be an immediate firsthand account of what happened. It's somebody who was there, it's somebody who was living at that time, who experienced it, who can tell you about it. Second, and it doesn't just have to be telling in person, it could be something they wrote, a letter, it could be something they filmed, anything like that. A secondary source is one where you've had somebody usually pull together several different primary sources, and they're compiling all of that information to get a clear picture out of what happened. So a secondary source is removed from the event, but they consult a lot of different primary sources in order to gather together the information. Those are things like textbooks that we read, or maybe History Channel documentaries that we watch. If you've ever watched John Green's Crash Course, John Green, it would be a secondary source. Um, Now, what you have to watch out for when you're consulting either a primary source or a secondary source is that you are going to have a point of view that you're being that the source is it has, whether that person has a certain way of thinking or whether the camera was only from one angle. There is a point of view that goes with that source. You might have a perspective that the person is coming from, a particular attitude towards something, or you could have biases or prejudices that go into play. Ideas that people have ahead of time, which influence the way they see things. They may not even realize they're being influenced, but they are. Those biases are usually things that either negative or positive can unfairly influence someone to believe or see something from a certain perspective or point of view. So those are the things that you have to look out for whenever you are doing, whenever you're looking at your sourcing. Oops. All right. Did I skip a slide? Nope. All right. Some professions that are related to history. First of all, you've got archaeologist. An archaeologist is someone who's going out looking at the site where they're excavating, digging up artifacts and things that they can study in order to gain an understanding um, of a civilization or of an area. An anthropologist is someone who also looks at those same things, but they study the human societies, their culture, and their development. They're looking more at the cultural part of it, the human part of it. A historian is someone who studies and writes about the past, maybe up here. This could be somebody who's an anthropologist, or it could be a historian gathering information. But there's somebody who studies the past and writes about it in order to be able, usually, to provide some kind of information to other people. It could be the people who are making the documentaries about things. It could be people who are writing textbooks or other books that we might read. Um, Historians might be like all the who was so and so, like who was George Washington, who was Babe Ruth. Those are historians who've gone out and gathered that information so they could write that book for others to read. Then you have historical interpreters. Excuse me. Historical interpreters are people who literally go out, dress in the clothing like the person would have done. They speak the way the person would have spoken. They've studied that particular person, that particular group of people, so that they can emulate the way they were and pretend to really be that person. That doesn't mean they go live that life, but it's like the people here at Old Salem. If you go to Old Salem and go tour around Old Salem, the people that you run into there who are dressed in the Moravian clothing, they're there to be a historic interpreter. They're there to show you what it was like to live during that time, to give you our perspective from today on that time when they were living. That's a historic interpreter. One great historic interpreter I saw is a lady who was doing a one person play for Harriet Tubman. She came and for an hour she was on stage. She was dressed like Harriet Tubman would have been dressed at the time. She spoke and walked like she would have as a very old woman, and she told all about her life. And when she was done with her play, which was riveting, she even answered questions for the kids in the audience, for the students I had at the time. She was taking on the role of Harriet Tubman to help us to understand Harriet Tubman today, living in the world that we live in. That's what a historic interpreter does. That's just four of the jobs that you can have. These are four of the different sources that we will use this year as we learn about the different civilizations from the past.